Hello, I'm Elison Santos. I'm here at the Chrysalis Center in Washington, D.C., and I have the pleasure to be here with two colleagues. They are the editors of this book, Logotherapy and Existential Analysis, Proceedings of the Viktor Frankl Institute, Vienna. The first one is Dr. Jay Levinson. He's a licensed psychologist in private practice in Baltimore, Maryland. He has lectured internationally and served on the faculties of both the Johns Hopkins University and the University of Maryland School of Medicine. He was privileged to serve as a special assistant, colleague, and friend to Dr. Frankl for over 20 years and edited his last book, Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning. Charles McLafferty has served on the faculties of the University of Virginia and the University of Alabama at Birmingham. He is the founder and president of Purpose Research, which seeks to incorporate meaning and purpose into the research, theory, and practice of the helping professions. McLafferty has edited and or published more than a dozen books on logotherapy by authors such as Joseph Fabry, Elizabeth Lucas, Paul Long, and Anne Graber. I'm so glad to be here with both of you. I feel honored to be here with both of you and also honored to be talking about this book. So what is the importance of this book and how did it start? How did you happen to be the editors of this book? Please, Charles.
Well, I have experience in editing and publishing, and was approached to see if I was interested in continuing this series. This is volume 2 of the series, and Alex Batthyány edited volume 1. So Alex is the series editor and asked us to continue the series.
What is the main difference? Can we talk about the main difference from the first to this one?
Well, I'm not sure that it's different in that the aim of each of them is to provide current, up-to-date research and innovations in thought, and to document the progress of logotherapy through the years. So I'm not sure that the difference is as important as the similarity, which is it shows a worldwide effort to research and to apply logotherapy and existential analysis around the world.
Mm-hmm. And there is something that you speak in your chapter about transcultural, this idea of having people from many parts of the world to write about logotherapy. And how is this experience for you?
Well, for me, first of all, I think one of the great parts about this book is the international flavor of it. I think that we had so many great chapters submitted that we really couldn't use them all. And we had the very difficult job of weeding out the ones that didn't quite fit for this volume and choosing the ones that met our goals the best, as Charles outlined. And I think that it was just wonderful to see all the great work that people are doing throughout the world. It was also a pleasure to work with Charles, who did the heavy lifting on this book, and his publishing experience was invaluable. Though I fought a lot of it all in the way, I learned a tremendous amount about publishing and about how to do these things. And I think you did an excellent job doing this. It was just a pleasure to work with you. And then to see the great researchers and contributors to the book from all over the world was just wonderful. And I think we're seeing the third generation of work, if you will, in logotherapy here. Right. And just enormously talented people who contributed. So that's really where the credit goes. For me, I really loved reading all the stuff and translating it, but it's a big challenge when you're editing work in English by people whose native language is not English.
Yes.
And sometimes I think it's easier to rewrite the chapters. There were two challenges. One is sometimes it's easier to rewrite it than it is to do it, but that's not the correct way to do it. I wanted to maintain integrity of the article. And I think the other thing is when you're reading things where the English is not quite perfect, what happens is it's easy to discount the content. And you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater. You want to be able to not lose these wonderful chapters and not lose the integrity of them and the flavor of them, and then still have them translated into English that's going to be understood by English-speaking audiences. So that was the big challenge, but it was a lot of fun to do, and it was really interesting to do. And I was just overwhelmed with all the great thinkers and writers that I had the opportunity to work with. Some of the empirical studies I think are just terrific. I mean, there's several parts to the book, and some of the casework is great, and it's just a nice variety of things in there. It gives a little bit of history, a little bit of research, a little bit of philosophy, teaching, and it's really, it's a great job. I think you did a great job. Charles did a great job of organizing it, and the editing and the technical editing, and it was just great. And the other thing I really liked was that because of the international flavor of it, there's a lot of integration of other kinds of therapy. Now, there's some particularly good articles in that maybe we'll discuss later, but you can see the cultural influences on logotherapy.
Right.
And, you know, Dr. Frankl's work, he's one of the few theorists and clinicians whose work applies to virtually every culture on earth.
Yeah.
You know, Adler doesn't apply in many cultures. Freud doesn't apply in many cultures. Even some of the cognitive behavioral stuff doesn't apply in many cultures. Frankl's book, for example, Man's Search for Meaning, last time I looked, was published in 38 different languages.
Yeah.
Now, that's not true for Freud, okay? And for other great authors, but his work transcends, and it transcends all the cultures. He's talked about finding meaning, things that every culture needs, and how to deal with unavoidable suffering, which is a common thing in every culture. So I think it was extremely important for us to include authors from all over the world, despite the extra challenge of that. I mean, to me, that just gives the book a different flavor and gives the people who read it a transcultural understanding of the impact of this man's work.
Yeah, sure. And well, I had also the honor to write an article there with Dr. Andres Antunes about suicide, right? And I was telling you that I was impressed about your work editing, and I imagine that it really was hard work for all the book, for all the articles. And well, did you find, how was it for you, Charles, to work with all these different languages and or at least different cultures? Did you find anything that was more surprise for you, or in the perception of how people understand Viktor Frankl's work in different places?
Well, first of all, I'd like to add on to what Jay said. Jay, I really appreciate working with you, and I can honestly say I couldn't have done this without you. And I also appreciate the authors that I know both of us do, and the patience of both Alex Batthyány and the editors at Springer. So the fact is that Viktor Frankl's theory applies to each of them uniquely, and each of them are so actively trying to understand it from their own perspective. And so in the same way, you know, editing these chapters was required the same kind of flexibility in thinking, to find out where someone's coming from, and to work at that point, as Jay said, not to change the meaning and not to change the perspective and orientation of the author. I think that was the most challenging part, and also the most fulfilling.
And I found myself really learning so much from the book, from the chapters that were submitted. You and I both had to research certain things that we weren't familiar with, and I thought it was such a great learning experience for me, and I'm sure for you too, and I hope for the people who read the book.
Yeah. And in fact, as you know from the work on your article, I frequently looked up articles that I hadn't seen before, and because I had access to a major university library and all of their resources, I probably found and downloaded 150 or 200 articles and dozens of books that I had not known existed until I did this editing work. But in checking the references, I'd come across an article, go, oh, that looks interesting, and download it, which took maybe 20 seconds longer than verifying the reference itself, so that it became not just a labor of love, but a very fruitful adventure.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you put it in the preface a quote by Frankl talking about these how he sees logotherapy to be eclectical in a way that new authors can go further. And he as the founder of the theory, he gives like a permission to us to try to go further, if it's even possible, but to try to see other things. And you quote that in the book. What to say more about that? When you say about the first generation, second generation, and third generation, what do you mean about that?
Well, for me, and one of the things I respected so much about Dr. Frankl is he wasn't defensive about his work. That if somebody challenged his work, he would challenge them. He'd say, great, go out and do the study, go out and add to my work. And I've heard said two ways, but to de-gurufy or de-guruize logotherapy, he said, I'm not the guru. You know, when Freud was teaching Freud, he literally said at one point that if your analyst doesn't know how to interpret something, they should ask their analyst, and if they don't know, they should ask their analyst. And the chain literally went back to Freud himself, and he was quoted as saying that. And of course, there was nobody else at the time, so I can sort of understand that. But Frankl said, I don't have all the answers. I want you to build on my work, go out there. And he was very supportive. In his apartment in Vienna, which I was privileged to be in several times, he has a whole, I call it a closet, but it's like a storeroom of every article that was sent to him after it was written about his work or a dissertation. He has copies of all these things that he keeps on his shelves because he's so proud how people went to the next thing. He was never the kind of person who said, I know everything. He said, take what I know, take what you know, and let's spread it out. Let's get more work done. Mm-hmm. And he was very, very encouraging. And even just personally for a second, as someone who spent a lot of time and truly was a student of his and had a great relationship with him, he was so patient with me when I didn't understand something, or I said something that was wrong, or and he was trying to teach me something, and he was just a great mentor and teacher because he wanted others to learn. He wanted to build on his theories. And I think that's the beauty of him. There are very few authors, at least in my experience, who can say, well, my book's a beginning, now you have to take it out there, especially a giant like Frankl, whose book, it is a beginning, but there's a lot more to it too. So I think it's just amazing for me, and that's what I love about it.
Can you give an example of when he was patient with you?
I'll tell you a couple of them. Well, there was one time, and remember that most of my work with him, a lot of my work with him was done before email. So we used to write letters back and forth, which is a lost art.
Wow.
And I have files and files and files of all the communication between us. And when he wrote his last book, Man's Search for Ultimate Meaning, as I think it says there, I headed it. He wanted me to do two things. One, his eyesight was going, so he couldn't see it to edit it. And he wanted me to edit, and he wanted me to what he called Americanize it. And as I did that, and so as I went through this book, I had about 6 single-space questions or comments I wanted to go over with him on big legal pads. And I wrote all the stuff down that I had questions about. And it's not a big book. I mean, and then we'd have to get on the phone between Baltimore and Austria, and I'd have to ask him if this is what he meant or if this is what he meant. And out of the 4 or 5 or 6 pages of notes, single space that I asked him about, there were only 4 corrections that I actually made.
Wow.
Part of it was because his English was better than mine, but also because each time he would explain to me exactly what he meant. German is a very precise language, and when he wrote these in English, every one but the first book. And when he did that, in his mind, he was saying it a certain way, but I just wasn't smart enough to understand what it meant a lot. So he would patient explained what he was trying to achieve, and I realized, well, of course he said it the right way. He's Viktor Frankl, he knows what he's talking about. And then I would learn so much as a result of that, and then I could carry that forward when I wrote about it or I gave a talk about it or something like that. And so it was a wonderful, wonderful experience for me. But that's a good example of just not, look, there are certain people in the world
Right.
who have not only a great ability to communicate, but who are so brilliant that they think in paradigms and models and not just in techniques. And he was one of those people who was just so brilliant, but he had such a way of being able to put it so the average person could understand it. And I think when a person like me, who is not in that category, works for a person like him, I think sometimes, I felt almost at times that I was sometimes dragging him down because I was so slow in trying to get to what he was achieving. But I learned so much, and, we worked so well together. And for me, he was so great at it, and that it really was something that I really admired about him. He was just a wonderful teacher. And if you've ever heard him talk or read his books or seen tapes of him talking, I mean, it's just, he was just amazing.
Yeah.
So.
You divided the book in 7 parts. How did you come to these 7 parts? So the first part is Viktor Frankl's legacy. The second, I love the title, Prevention and Amelioration of Suffering, Fostering Hope. That's really a beautiful title. And the third part is Research in Logotherapy, Case Studies. And the fourth, Research in Logotherapy, Empirical Studies. The fifth is Practical Applications of Logotherapy, Education, Youth, and the Workplace. And the sixth part is Theory and Philosophy of Logotherapy. And the seventh is Book Reviews. So how did you come to these division and why?
Well, I'm pretty fond of using spreadsheets. And so I put all the chapters up there and began to categorize what was this about. And then I would look at groupings of those. So as we noted in the preface, it's not really possible to make such clean distinctions. So for example, in Prevention and Amelioration of Suffering, there are some case studies. Daniel Brazzoni's chapter on writing therapy and the search for meaning, a case history, is a case study. And yet it had so much to do with ameliorating suffering that I thought it should be in there. On the other hand, Theresa Chantal's article, which is actually about childhood sexual abuse, and it's a very difficult chapter with 4 case studies. Because the case studies predominate in it as a demonstration of theory, they were so powerful that I thought that belonged in the case study section.
Right.
But it's like combing hair to write down what each of the articles is about and what it contains, and then look over and over again. And a good qualitative researcher can find categories in the content analysis. And so I used to teach that, and I was able to do that. So that's how I did it. As far as whether they're the best possible, I don't know. I couldn't tell you.
I think they were great the way you organized it, because I think there's a little something for everybody in this book. If you're a teacher, if you're a professor, if you're a researcher, if you're a clinician, if you're interested in those things but you do something else, even I think, people do pastoral counseling, there's a little something for everybody here. Right. And I think by grouping it the way you did, even though there's some overlap, of course there's overlap, I think people can look at the table of contents and say, this is interesting, or this is interesting. The first part with a little bit of a history of who he was and things, all that is interesting. It sets a stage for the rest of it. So I love the way he's organized it, and he did a great job.
Yeah, this first part is amazing, and there is a chapter by you right in the beginning.
Yes.
And it's really nice, really amazing. And I love one thing that you say, that he told you, Frankl told you about do your most unpleasant task first, and the rest.
I use that all the time with some of my patients who are procrastinators or have trouble getting started.
Yeah.
And I always, I think it was one of those times where I was having trouble getting started, working on something for him. And, he's much busier than I was. And so I asked him one day, well, how do you get so much done? I thought it's because he drank a lot of coffee, but apparently he only did that when he traveled. But really, he just said that he said, I do the thing that I want to do least first in the day and get out of the way, and then I can do the things I want to do that are more interesting to me or that are less burdensome. And I thought, that's a good thing, and I really try to do that. I do that myself now. It's one of his habits I adopted among many.
Yeah.
So.
And then you go to a lot of topics that are very important. One is another one is don't worship money, and you talk about a lot of things that happen today, like guns and other things, right? So it's very updated. I mean,
right. Well, I was raised in an upper middle class home and had lots of privilege that, I was very, very fortunate to have that helped me get where I am, but I feel a little bit guilty for in today's world. But I think that Frankl didn't care about money. All he wanted to do was help people. I've often told the story about Man's Search for Meaning being sold for $200, the rights in English. And when I asked him about that many years later, and I said to him, this is not fair. This book has sold 20 million copies. I know lots of good lawyers in the United States who can reopen negotiations with Simon & Schuster. They really kind of, ripped you up, I thought, but they didn't. It was the deal. And he waves his hand, 999. He says to me, I'll hear no more of that nonsense. Wow. And I tried to bring it up one more time. And he said, please, I'm not interested in the money. And for me, that was an important lesson because that's one of the things that helped me to leave my family business, which was a very lucrative business, and decide to go back to graduate school when at the time there were other circumstances involved. And I realized that you don't have to worship money. You live on what you make, you enjoy what you have, and that's what's meaningful, and the work is meaningful, and that's what counts. Nobody ever died wishing they'd spend more time at the office.
Yeah.
And I think that in America particularly, but other countries too, we tend to really worship money, and I think that's as Frankl talks about in Man's Search for Meaning in some of his other books, that's a false god. Money doesn't bring happiness. Happiness is a byproduct of leading a meaningful life. You do what people can do. He often spoke for free in places. They just fly him over, he and Ellie, but he often didn't get an honorarium. And if he thought your group was worthy, he'd speak for free. He'd travel 10,000 miles to speak for free. I don't know anybody else who does that or did that, okay? And it's one of the things, again, it's one of those things I learned for myself as a person, not just as a clinician. I always say in this and other articles that I learned much more from him outside the classroom. With the ability to accompany him on various endeavors that he did and people he talked to and the way he conducted himself. He was such a fine human being, which of course comes across in all his work, that we have to rehumanize psychotherapy. It's a human connection that counts with the people we work with. And he would often talk about that. And that's a different model than we do in this country for the most part. Medicine here is how much money can we squeeze out from the insurance company and leave time. And so I just think there was so much there. And so I tried to discuss some of the things I learned from him in that chapter. And I was very privileged to be able to be exposed to that because he's basically a very private person.
Listen to everything that you say because you lived with him. You had an experience to be with him for many years. I think we want to keep listening to everything that you say because everything tells a lot about who he is and how his theory fits to everything that he lives.
And when people would challenge his theories, he would say, great, prove me wrong or improve on it. And he would not argue with them if they didn't want to endorse his theories. He said, fine, use what you can use from it. He himself said that he didn't use just logotherapy with his patients. He was a true eclectic. Another thing I like about the book is there's so many different points of view here that we're representing. he was the first true eclectic. You know, when I was in grad school back in the dark ages, they said, don't ever tell anybody you're eclectic when you interview for residency because you won't get a job.
Yeah.
And I said, but that's what I am. And, you know, he said he would use it on 20% of his patients. I think that was a little bit of a mistranslation.
Yeah.
I think what he did was he used it with every patient for at least 20% of the therapy.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay. And
Makes
that's
sense.
what I find myself doing. I use some logotherapy with every patient who comes in the door, but I use whatever other techniques, whatever other things I can do to help me connect with that person. But the humanness is what comes in. And he was such a fine human being. You know, if you've ever seen Albert Ellis speak, and I'm not denigrating anybody because Albert Ellis was a brilliant man, but he was a character. And he was colorful, to say the least. And he would put people down. I saw him debate Sidney Smith one time at the Menninger Clinic. And he starts calling his names and denigrating his work, and Sidney Smith gets up to give his part of the debate, and Ellis walks out of the room. Okay? And he comes back later and says, well, I hope you didn't listen to that baloney. That's not the way he said it. And you know, Ellis didn't do that. And Sidney Smith was a gentleman, but you have to take from him. But he wouldn't engage with that. He'd say, you don't have to let my theories down, use them. Use what works for you.
Yeah.
There's more than one way to skin a cat, as we say in English.
Yeah. Well,
And to pick up on that, one of the things that both Roberto Asagili, who developed psychosynthesis, and Viktor Frankl, who developed logotherapy, found in their research was that a spiritual psychology, a psychology that includes the spirit, was useful only in about 20% of the clients, of the population.
right.
Now, as Jay says, logotherapy is very useful to apply in all cases. And one of the ways, just talking with a logotherapy student last week, one of the tools or the frameworks that logotherapy gives us is the dimensional ontology of soma, psyche, and the nous. And just by walking into a session or working with someone who wants help with that in mind, we can evaluate, is this a physiological problem? Is this a problem in the psyche and the emotions or intellect, in the thinking processes? Or is this a spiritual problem? Is this a problem of a conflict of values? Or is this something that needs medication?
Or even a combination.
Right, or a combination, exactly.
Yes.
So that just having a dimensional ontology
Yeah.
changes the way we look at people.
Yeah.
Instead of looking at them as widgets that need to be fixed, a cognitive behavioral therapist may go, well, they have cognitive disharmonies or discongruences that have to be corrected, and they have to see the pattern and monitor it and see the pattern. Logotherapy adds to that by adding a focus on meaning that allows those conflicts to assume a lesser role, and by themselves, Frankl says, they'll disappear. But if someone's problem is only cognitive, which is rarely the case, but if someone's problem is only cognitive, CBT is absolutely wonderful.
Yeah.
And Frankl was the first to say, mine's not the only one,
Exactly.
but it plays friendly with others.
And in fact, we have a couple of those articles in the book, the one by Maddie O'Malley, integrating cognitive therapy with logotherapy. She's done great work in the field. She's written a lot of articles.
Rational motive.
Rational motive therapy. To me, that's a form of cognitive therapy. And I think that she's been integrating with that to the point that we're now have been talking to the president of the Ellis Institute in New York to try to do some programs together and to do some of the integration of the work, which I think is very, very important. And there is a big overlap because a lot of the more modern therapies, when they do their research and they do their literature search, man's search for meaning comes up because Frankl was talking about a lot of these ideas back in the 20s and the 30s. You know, he was the first person to have a behavioral process for example, sexual dysfunction in males. Okay, he was the first person to do that. And there's lots of other ways where he comes up. So the integration is very important because we can learn from them and they can learn from us.
Yeah. And I think it changes us when we learn a logotherapy, right? My training in psychology first was of psychoanalysis, as it is for most of Brazilians.
Including
and
Frankl.
Yeah, exactly.
Frankl was also that,
And I remember starting my practice as a psychoanalyst. And then in the first year, I was lucky enough to get to know logotherapy. And I started to apply it, and it changed the way I saw the clients, I saw the patients, and how I deal with them.
Could I give you a good example of that? I do a lot of teaching of residents and different people. And usually when I give my thing with the residents, and usually I'm called in because I do a lot of work in bereavement and death and dying. And I do a lot of teaching on that in hospitals and university. And so a lot of times I'll have these seminars, and usually over the course of the weeks, at least once or twice, I will have somebody pull me aside afterwards, one of the residents, and say, Dr. Levinson, I'm so sorry. I messed up so bad in the counseling. I was listening to a story about a woman whose child died, she says, and I started crying. Now, if you're a Freudian and you start crying in a session, your supervisor is going to nail you. You're going to fail that session. And I said, and my answer was the same. I said, you're a human being. I said, when you get teary with people whose children have died, they know you're hearing them, that you're trying to understand it from. You can't be empathetic until you, God forbid, go through it. But you can certainly try to understand it and feel the emotion, be a human being. I said, don't apologize for that. Use it to your benefit. It's not countertransference if you use it to help the patient and connect and bond with the patient. So,
I think it's part of Frankl's freedom, right?
Yes, it is. And so I was reflecting on that freedom on the drive up this morning, and that if we were created perfect, then we wouldn't have a choice to make. And if we don't have a choice to make, we don't have any responsibility. And the fact that we are not created perfect, that we are created with imperfection, and yet we have a sense of perfection within us, as our own inner religion tells us. But since we have a sense of perfection and yet we're created imperfect, then that very imperfection must give us a sense of why we were created, of what our meaning is in finding perfection. And so for each of us, we have to find meaning uniquely. Each of us has to find it. And so a set method or approach isn't going to work. And that makes teaching logotherapy, much less researching it or writing about it, very difficult to have one consistent way of doing it. And that gets back to Frankl being so open, that quote that we used in the preface about allowing other viewpoints, even if he disagrees with them. That was a preface from another book that we selected from to close the preface. Even if he disagreed with them, he still honored them because they were part of what the process of logotherapy was about.
Yeah. Well, in the book, there are many chapters that the author is talking about his or her experiences, right? And one of them is one that you were part of it with Robert Brown, right? And his work with soldiers who were coming from Iraq during the war there. And well, it's amazing the way that he speaks about his experience, right?
It was, and I don't think that chapter really describes his own experience. He's now, I think, 93. And I talked with him a couple weeks ago. I actually had him as a professor, as an undergraduate, more than 4 decades ago. And he, as a psychiatrist, he would bring patients in, just like Frankl did. He'd bring patients into class. There are 300 or 400 undergraduates in the auditorium. It was one of the most popular classes at the university. And they would talk about what they discovered and how they had insights that led to healing or getting better. He's not a logotherapist, but as Frankl noted, some people practice logotherapy without knowing it.
Yeah.
And he wrote a 600-page book of these case studies. So he closed his practice in Charlottesville moved up to Fort Lee and lived there, coming home on weekends. He would give his patients his cell phone number so that they could reach him anytime. And he just focused on being present with them and serving as what he called an attachment figure. But in those case studies, as I read his book, it seemed that there were elements there and moments there where he was practicing a meaning-centered existential analysis. And so we talked about it and included those in the chapter. They're really quite moving. I can't read them without coming to tears myself.
I think one of the things in that chapter, particularly with Bob Brown, was, like you said, the end tips, the humanness that comes through in the writing was just beautiful. I think the same thing in Taria Chantal's chapter, the Israeli head, and she also was head of the department at the University of South Africa in psychology. At the end, she has a poem at the end of hers. It's extremely moving. But those were the two I thought really had the humanness really came through. Yours with Bob Brown and hers, and I thought there was a real humanness, and that's so important to the whole concept of logotherapy. So that's great.
That's why I put them together.
Yeah, I'm sure.
They are they're wonderful case studies, and they're the most pure case studies possible. In Taria Chantal's, the poem at the end came from one of her clients who is now a logotherapist and is practicing at the clinic.
Right.
It's so nice, yeah.
And by the way, the other one you wrote, the other article, the other chapter you have, From Meaning to Purpose, I love the way you talk about finding the greatest gift. You talked about free will, and that's in your chapter. That's what you call it. The greatest gift is the gift of free will, that you can be a person and still make choices and still be effective and still deal with the world. And at this time in the world, we need this more than anything.
Yeah. And so getting back to this created imperfect thing, the sentence that the insight that I had that came in a flash that relates to that in that article is that in our imperfection lies hid the secret of our indispensability. Because if we created imperfect, then that imperfection must have been put there on purpose and contrasted with the perfection that we feel inside, deep inside in our quietest moments. It's that tension that allows us and shows us our indispensability, the place at which we cannot be replaced. And often that sense of imperfection, however we feel it, whether it's guilt or sadness or regret, there's always a sense of longing when we have a sense of perfection within us. That sense is actually the clue to our indispensability, why we're here like nobody else on this planet.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, the great author Harold Kushner, who wrote When Bad Things Happen to Good People.
Yeah.
He was a very big fan of Dr. Frankl, and he knew him, and he didn't know him personally, but he had met him, and he took a lot of his work from him. And he used to say that when his son died, he didn't even think he could remain a member of the clergy, let alone keep believing in the religious beliefs he heard as a child in Sunday school, where they teach God as a puppet meister in the world and controlling, I'm going to punish this one and save this one, and God will save you if you're good, or the good die young, and all these platitudes that we used to get. And he said he didn't even think he could remain in a religion. And then finally, and it's in one of his later books, so maybe that one, where he talks about the idea that he realized that God is not a puppet meister who is pulling the strings, but he created a natural universe, building on what you're saying, and it's imperfect and things happen, and God is there for consolation in these times, not to undo the things that happened or that kind of thing or prevent them, but the natural universe is problems. People are imperfect. You only have to look around the world to see that. And he said that was when he saw that God was there for consolation in the tough times. He said that's when he could remain a rabbi and a member of the Jewish faith and continue his work. And that's when he started publishing more and more about things. And I mean, he spoke at the conference that you and I were at in Dallas.
2007.
2007. And he was a wonderful man. He reminds me a lot of Dr. Frankl, actually. They have very compatible views on things.
Frankl writes about that. There's a beautiful text of him when he writes about community and mass. He talks about imperfection, why we are imperfect, and exactly the way you were saying, right?
Right. So he says if we were perfect, we'd be interchangeable and replaceable.
Yeah, yeah.
But we're not. And it was from that statement that I turned it around, flipped it around, and said, wait,
Right.
then in our imperfection must lie hid the secret of our indispensability.
That's so
Because
amazing.
if we were perfect, we'd be replaceable. We're not perfect, so we're not replaceable. So there must be something really important about exactly how we are imperfect.
Yeah, yeah,
Now, if we're in a
Yeah.
random universe,
yeah.
we're just a random combination of DNA
Yeah.
floating through space on a rock.
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
which is the exercise of the scales of existence that Frankl brings to our attention. That we have to decide whether meaning exists or whether we're just random creatures.
And if we understand that, then we will understand the importance of compassion and love, right?
Yes.
And how he is very against the collective guilt and how he sees the word in a very compassive way, right?
He was very unpopular for many years among American Jewish audiences for his views on collective guilt,
Yeah,
because he doesn't believe in it. He understood that the average German didn't have the ability to fight the government any more than anybody else once Hitler was in office, and that most people can't be what he called a hero, meaning sacrifice themselves to a cause that's going to cost them their own lives, or going to cost them to be sent to concentration camps. I won't go into it, but I had a long debate with him one night when I was his graduate assistant about it, because I came from the opposite view. Americans like Elie Wiesel. They like people who want to, bring everybody to justice, make them accountable for their behaviors and things like that. And, it's a much more complex problem than that.
exactly. Yes, and as we were talking about the how updated logotherapy is, and we can't figure out exactly what Viktor Frankl would say today about everything that is happening in the world, but we can imagine, right, by his reading books and everything that he wrote.
And I think he would want us, I get lots of questions when I talk, I'm sure you do too, what would Frankl say about this or that?
Yeah.
And I say, I don't speak for Viktor Frankl, but I can tell you what I got from it and what I do with it.
Yeah.
And I think that's what he would want. Again, he wants you to build on what he said
Exactly,
and
yes.
use it the best way that I can use it through my history. Every therapist, contrary to theories about countertransference and things, everything a therapy does is a combination of what they knew going through their own history and how they can help the patient. And I think this is a good example of that. I bring what I bring to the world, what he brings to the world, what Charles brings to the world. Anything I know, I'll use. I'm shameless. Right. And I think that's what makes it work. And that he was the first one to say that. Freud threw him out of the Vienna circle because he had differing views from him. Adler threw him out of the Society for what's it called?
Individual psychology?
The Adlerian school.
Individual psychology.
Yeah, individual psychology for the same reason. He couldn't tolerate that he was writing other articles about other things. And, it's almost like being a heretic in ancient religion.
Exactly, yeah. And it's our responsibility now, right? Because we are living today. So what each one of us say about what's going on?
But I want to build on both of these comments with your saying, wondering what Frankl would say, and you're saying that Frankl would ask us to, because the fact is, as you said, once you understand logotherapy, you bring a different perspective. It's no longer psychoanalysis. You can't even do psychoanalysis anymore because you have a different perspective. The point here of the deglorification of logotherapy that Frankl talked about was that it wasn't that we would parrot what he said, it's that we will come to an understanding of meaning and purpose, of our own orientation to meaning and purpose, or better yet, to the partner of our most intimate conversations. And with that relationship, we would come to our own understanding that would be a perspective that included the dimensions of logotherapy, but it would be our own. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
So
totally. Yeah.
logotherapy leaves us responsible.
Yeah.
And it leads to the door of religion, but no further. But the point is, once we become responsible, we don't need a logotherapist, we don't need Viktor Frankl, we don't need a guru. We have become our own guru in that sense, with the help of the partner of our most intimate conversation.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
And we have a couple chapters in the book where the research shows this,
Yes.
which I thought was good.
Yeah.
Bill Evans's and a couple of other chapters that really emphasize the fact that they're building on it and integrating it as part of their own personal philosophy, as well as being true to the spirit of logotherapy.
Yeah. There's this chapter by Edward Marshall, right, and Maria Marshall
yeah, I love that one.
about moral
Management of moral injury.
Yeah, that's really interesting. With the workers, the healthcare workers during COVID, right?
Yeah. Where they struggle with the difference between what they call the moral injury, meaning the conflict between your own personal values and what's imposed upon you by those in authority.
Exactly. It has to do with what we were saying about responsibility and
he said it actually leads to PTSD type symptoms, you know.
Yes.
And he talked about how to deal with all that. Yeah, I love that chapter by both of them. They're great people too, by the way. In Canada, they're doing a great job up there.
And there are other chapters, right, that I love. Also the chapter about auto-ethnography by Benjamin Aiken. He talks about his experience as well, right, with a friendship, with a relationship, and it's really beautiful. Meaning in Life, Changing by Rachel Azagba. And well,
let's not forget yours on suicide prevention,
Right,
which I think is so important. You know, as you point out in your chapter, this was one of the first work that Frankl did after residency. One of the first things he did in Austria in those days, when you graduated high school, you took an exam. And it's not like here where if you have a son that wants to be an artist and he can apply to art school and he can become whatever he wants. In Austria, you took this exam and then they told you what you were going to become. Whether you went to college or whether you went to medical school or law school, this one exam at 17 years old determined that.
exactly.
At 17 years old, I didn't even know anything about myself or what I wanted to be. This is my third profession. So I think that in your article you talk about that, and there was a high rate of suicide for people who didn't get what they wanted.
Yeah.
The first year that Frankl developed this program to get these kids ready for this exam and how to deal with it when they didn't get what they want, there were 0 suicides for the first time among these 17 and 18-year-olds. The first time in the history of this exam. So I think I think your article goes right into that, and even when you talk about his work in the camps, where he would go from hut to hut to help them deal with the terrible things in concentration camps. But what people don't realize is if he had been caught, he would have been executed on the spot.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think your article does a great idea. It does a great job of focusing on the need for attitudinal values and resilience and self-transcendence and suicide prevention, which, as you know, is still is it the leading killer or second leading killer of adolescents in the United States? Second?
I want to say here, you have a wonderful case study of Anne. And the case study was so powerful that this would have fit under prevention and amelioration of suffering and fostering hope. It would have been perfect in there. But the case study is so powerful that I felt it belonged in the case studies, because it's the application of logotherapy, but it's the example of it in a case study so beautifully that I thought it should be in there. Would you like to talk a little bit about that article?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, for me, it was a surprise when I came to the historical facts of what Viktor Frankl did in his early years there in Vienna, right? I didn't know many of them before I started working in the article, and what called my attention very much is the fact that he was writing in the newspaper at that time. He was writing and being active in his community and discussing with many people there who were writing about suicide, and they were they were trying to imagine the cause of this suicide, the suicides that were happening among the youth. And Viktor Frankl went there and he debated with them, saying, well, it's not because of economic factors. That's not the main problem. That we don't give the youth space for them to talk about the important things in life. Right. So he was very young, and he was saying that, and he was active in his community. And that I think that is the main part there in my article, and then it corroborates the case study, and also, of course, all the rest of the theory about meaning and the search for meaning, and in something that happens in Anne, right? This name that we give for this client, and I think that happens with many youth today, right? That they think that there is no more meaning, right, in life, and with everything that is happening in the world, they can come to this negative conclusion that, well, humanity shouldn't exist anymore, should be alienated, right? So, and that is powerful, and many people are thinking that, right, and they give up. And these other aspects that Frankl will speak about, the pathologies of the zeitgeist, right? I think they explain very much what is going on in our lives today, and the radicalization, the radicalism, the fanaticism, the fatalism, and this idea that, well, why am I going to be good if everyone else is bad? Why am I going to do anything good in my life? So the sense of giving up, right? And well, this article was also part of became a book that the title is "What Keeps You Alive." So the idea is that when we study suicide, we see many authors talking about the causes of suicide. Oh, okay, what is the cause? Well, what made you think about committing suicide? So I think that Frankl goes to the other way. He says, oh, well, what is life?
In Man's Search for Meaning, he says it so beautifully, where he quotes the Latin, where he says, people need an apologio pro vita sua, a justification for their existence.
Yeah.
And I think you're right. I think that's, again, one of his unique kind of contributions.
So when he worked with youth, he tried to keep them from hyper-reflecting on the test and instead focus on what they wanted to do afterwards. And so by looking beyond the scary test, by having something to focus on, they could break that cycle of hyper-intention, hyper-reflection. And, you know, it kind of parallels what happened to me when I took a motorcycle safety course 2 or 3 decades ago. One of the things they talk about is when you're on a motorcycle, if you find out something's in your way, the tendency is to look straight at it. And they said that's the way to guarantee you will drive straight into it.
Yeah.
But if you look beyond, if you see a path around it or beyond it, and you look that way, then you'll be able to avoid it. And it's exactly what Frankl did with these youth. And that's what logotherapy does with meaning. By finding meaning that is an orientation to meaning, however the person knows it, then they can fulfill Nietzsche's quote from Frankl. The person who has a why to live for can endure almost anyhow.
Yeah, and I love that video where we have this video online where Frankl is talking to students in America. I don't know where, maybe you know. And he says very passionately that we have to overestimate human being. And he speaks very strongly about that, because if we overestimate human being, we will help them to achieve where they
see their
really
potential, not what they are, but see where they can go, and help them find, more importantly, where they go. They have to discover that you can't give them.
And he says it must be the motto of psychology.
Yeah.
Right. So he paraphrased Goethe. If we take a person as they are, we make them less than they could be.
Exactly.
But if we take them as they can be, we help them to be who they are.
Exactly.
Yes. I think that's correct.
You know, one of the
that's
things
right,
that I think really hurts psychotherapy, in my country at least, was when the insurance companies started telling you how many sessions you could have with somebody to cure them, okay? And telling you, well, you have to do it this way, you have to do it that way. And, you know, it's not up to us, it's up to the patient, it's up to them to do it. We're guiding them, but when you do that, you're saying this is all you're worth. You're worth 7 sessions or 10 sessions. And that's when I started dropping out a network of insurance companies, because you can't tell a therapist or a patient how many sessions they need.
Yeah.
You have to work through it with them. And yes, you can, a lot of the therapies are out there, and again, I'm not denigrating anybody, just treat symptoms. If you're anxious, they'll teach you how to deal with your panic attacks only.
Yeah.
But what about the underlying cause, the frustrations, whatever the underlying cause?
Sure.
You know, Frankl says take them to their potential. Help them, like you said, be what they can be. You know, it reminds me of the commercial for the Army, be all you can be. You know? But I think that's so important.
Yeah.
Many people are not raised to see their potential. They're raised to conform to some standard that their culture tells them is this is what you should be.
Yeah.
And this is what's important. In the U.S., it might be too often money, or it might be power. In other countries, there's other things.
Yeah. Well, in my experience, I think that this is the main cause of existential vacuum.
I agree.
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of things in this book that we can cover, right? And what else would you like to say about the book for everyone who is watching us and he is willing and desiring to have the book? And
I would recommend that it's an expensive book, and so people who want to have access to it may want to go to their library and see if they can access it through their library through an electronic copy, or simply ask their library to access specific chapters for them if they're relevant. And that may be a way to get around that. And many university libraries do have access to the full Springer catalog at no addition. They're paying a fee, a subscription fee, and can access it for them. So.
Yep, that's a very good point. And then I think we have to stress that, to say that, well, it was published by Springer. It's very important. I think that for logotherapy, because Springer is it's a wonderful publisher, right? And known everywhere for the books that they publish. And I think that one of the challenges for logotherapy in the world is how can we be recognized as a theory, right? In the scientific community, for example. And the book not just brings a lot of research and empirical research as well, but it's also published by this publisher that is very well known, right? And I think it's a very good point as well.
I also think this book is a book that brings in so much of the world and applies so much. I think when you read a book like this, I mean, you can get a lot out of reading Frankl's books and Fabry and Elizabeth Lucas and lots of the famous people who've done great work in it. But this is a compilation. This gives you more up-to-date stuff. This is the next generation of work in logotherapy. Early on, it was very hard. The tools didn't exist to measure existential traits like meaning in life. It wasn't until the late 60s, I believe. Was it late 60s when Frankl came out with this test? Do you know offhand?
I don't have a date. I thought it was mid-60s. But
It may have been mid-60s at the University of Mississippi. We came up with the first test of measuring purpose in life. They're very hard to measure, and then they get the validity and reliability, and that's what people want. They want to see the efficacy of this stuff. And I think now we have so many more tools. We have so many creative and brilliant researchers and clinicians who are using all this stuff that I think this kind of book can bring you up to date. This kind of book tells you what the next generation is to build on. And there's so many great minds, and I'm so grateful to Dr. Alex Batthyány, who's a series chair, and to your idea to interview us for this, and to the great people who contributed, because I think this is a book that will really do a lot of good. It's a textbook. It's not really written for laymen, though there are parts that laymen can read, but it really, if you want to study logotherapy, this is the kind of book that's really going to motivate you and help you get there. I mean, again, I have a biased view. I realize it's my book, but I think it's not out there. These books aren't out there. I also like Menda Osmert's chapter because he applies it to the business world. Right. And he's done a lot of work in that. Yeah. My wife was a pharmaceutical rep for over 30 years, and every once in a while they would send her a motivational tape or a motivational disc quoting Frankl. And I've heard from lots of people that this happens. People always tell me about these things. I've heard from lots of people that they're in business, they quote Frankl a lot, especially in sales and that kind of thing. And so it just applies to so much. And that's why I was happy to see his submission, because it gives you a different perspective.
Right. And also, you also quote some celebrities in your chapter, right? Michael Phelps and Jimmy Fallon, right? They talking about
sports stars use it all the time. I've treated some professional athletes and some college and high school athletes, and motivation is a big thing, because if you take a sport like American baseball, if you're trying to hit a baseball, you're going to fail 70% of the time, and that makes you a superstar. Okay?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so the idea of how do you deal with that? How do you get up the next time when you get strike out 4 times the night before, and these kinds of things? And it's very motivational in so many areas.
There is one other, a pair of articles that was curious to me, in that in 1993, when I attended my first World Congress, Elizabeth Lucas spoke. She was the keynote speaker, and she spoke on Waiting for Godot. I don't know if you were in Toronto for that. I
don't think so, but I heard about it.
I had never met Lucas. I didn't know who she was, and I was blown away by the talk. It is reprinted in a book that Purpose Research published, but it's called Waiting for Godot, and she mentioned the work of a Polish researcher who proposed noetic temporality. That is, our place in time, how we look at ourselves in terms of the past, present, and future. His name is Popielski, and I got to meet him at the First World Congress, by the way. It was wonderful. What's interesting is that in these 2 chapters from Tiago Aquino and company and Dmitry Leontiev, one from Brazil, and some of the authors are from Spain, I believe, and Dmitry Leontiev is from Russia. In each of these articles, the researchers have taken the purpose in life test, translated it into the native language, but they have discovered or altered it in a way that looks at the person's perspective of time, the noetic temporality, whether they use that term or not, the noetic temporality, how the person looked at time in relation to themselves and meaning, and adapted the purpose in life test to that. So in 2 different continents, a similar process is happening. And the point that Lucas made in that keynote address 30 years ago was that Popielski discovered that people who are stuck in the past or have a really long-term future, an impossible future to meet, if that's their perspective, they're much more likely to have an existential crisis or to have a psychological difficulties. The healthiest stance noetically was in the present and the near future. That is, the things that we can achieve that are realistic. And so it's in keeping the perspective in that orientation. This is another kind of perspective change that logotherapy offers. But the point is that by having a sense of noetic temporality, we have another perspective on logotherapy and how we can apply it. So I just thought both of these articles, which are put serially together, had interesting research on that topic.
I agree.
It was a pleasure to have both of you here we're together here in Washington, D.C. What a nice moment. I'm very happy to be here with both of you and our families here. And it's really nice. Well, congratulations on this. This is a great achievement. I think this is a very great contribution to logotherapy in the world. And congratulations to you. Thank you very much for your work. And well, also congratulate to all the authors, right? And also to Springer. Yeah, please keep publishing logotherapy books.
Thank you for the opportunity. Thank you for your hard work too.
And thanks to the authors who did all the hard work. I mean, let's face it,
Yeah.
couldn't do it without them.
Right. Yeah, well, special thanks to Lucas Reguin Santos, João Pedro Reguin Santos, Edivani Reguin Santos, Lori Levinson, for all their help here organizing this taping for us. That's great. That is great. Well, you want to talk more?
I think I've told you everything I know.
I think we should talk about lunch.
Right, yeah.